Welcome to Bible Talks. I'm Nathan Clark.
And I'm Seth Merritt.
And here today, as we continue our discussion of the book, One Blood, One Race, we just want to encourage you that if you have anything that you'd like to share with us, make sure that you give us an email or comment in the media below. But our email address is spbibletalks@gmail.com, and we always look forward to hearing from you. And just a reminder that the best way that you can invest in this ministry is with your like and shares. We don't ask for money, but we do encourage that if you see something that is something that you agree with and think is important, we ask that you share it so that others can see it as well and help this ministry grow in that area. Amen. Well, Seth, I pray that you've had a good week.
I have. It's finally getting warm, able to get a little bit of work done.
All right. Well,
coming along nicely.
Well, that's good. Well, so far, Seth, we've this book is obviously a large. It's got a lot of stuff in it, and I think that I'm accurate when I say that we haven't necessarily hit every dot or tittle that we could about this book. We just don't want to waste people's time. But we've come to the probably the last chapter that we're going to, as deep as we're going to go into this book. And now we're so far we've talked about basically the idea of animal genetics, and the concept that all animals, we'll say the feline race of animals, has one common ancestor. And we looked at whether that is possible or impossible. Then we moved on to whether or not to people, whether or not it's possible for all the people, the different peoples that we see in the world, whether or not it is possible that they all have one common ancestor. But now we're getting into, we'll say, probably the most sensitive part of this whole subject, where the book that we're looking at here is taking us down the road of whether or not it is appropriate or biblical or in God's eyes something that He desires, that the different peoples of the world, the concept that they are all just come from Adam and Eve, that there are no real differences, and that opens up the door of whether or not it's appropriate for these people to enter into relationships outside of their own kind. So I'm going to go ahead and let you give us some opening thoughts on this chapter, where I believe we're in chapter number 5.
Yes.
And the title of this chapter is, I believe, One Blood.
It was.
And so it kind of is built off. I don't know that it's really built off of, but nonetheless, the Bible verse is thrown in there, which we'll probably look at that today before the day's out. But the Bible verse there in Acts chapter 17, verse 26, where Paul is quoted saying that all people are of one blood, and I think that's the sounding board that Ken Ham is going off of on this.
It is. Oh, I have found in this particular chapter, Nathan, that there are a very large number, probably a lot more than we're going to have time to talk about, of some classical logical fallacies.
Okay.
One of them, I think that, and this really goes through this whole book, and they have set up Charles Darwin as a somewhat of a straw man. You know, the straw man argument, you set up the straw man and then you just beat it and kick it, and that's how you make your argument. And we certainly don't want to be in the position of defending Darwinism. It's not the point. But the point is that many of the things that are being discussed, that they are accusing, that the authors, Mr. Ham in particular, are accusing Mr. Darwin of doing and laying it at his feet, simply aren't. He's not responsible for them, and it did not originate with him.
Now, I'm not sensing that you're defending Darwin, am I?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. But let me give you an example. In the particular copy of the book that I've read on page 99, there's a statement made that the author says that sin in a fallen world is infused with evolutionary thinking. And in the sentences before and after that, he had been explaining that the evolutionary thinking he was talking about was Darwinism, or as he refers to, Darwin's garden. And since the topic of the book is race, differences of the human races, we're not really specifically talking about, difference in dogs and cats.
Right.
a person should ask the question: did no one notice racial differences prior to Darwin's publishing of the book Origin of Species?
Well, if you'd read the first couple of chapters of his book, you would get that idea that, at least from his point of view, that before Darwin, everyone saw everyone the same. There was no differences, and everyone understood everybody.
Yes, that's really the underlying current that's running through this whole book, and that's why I say it's not. They are giving Darwin too much credit, and they're also using him as a straw man,
Right.
in my estimation, in the book, and it's just really not. It simply isn't necessary. You know, if you wanted to discuss the issue from a modern scientific perspective, I think we know, and I bet our listeners are aware, that most of modern science is anti-Christian. We don't have to go back to Darwin to find this.
That's right.
And that's another real problem that I think should be noticed by readers of this book, that current scientific opinion is repeated as absolute fact when it agrees with the presupposition of the author. So for what I mean to say by this is that they will quote very favorably statements made by geneticists and others who are arguing for the absolute sameness and equality of all peoples on the earth. Yet these same individual scientists would totally reject the Scripture. So that is what we would call in the fallacy catalog. It's the popular fallacy and an appeal to authority for their basic argument. It does, who makes the argument really doesn't say anything about whether or not the argument's true or false.
Right.
Is what I'm trying to communicate basically, and that this chapter in particular seems to be full of that argument.
Yeah. Well, I like the point that you made about the scientific perspective. As he begins this chapter, the second sentence, as we look in this chapter, he says, up to this point, we spent a lot of time looking at historical, biblical, and scientific facts. So he, apparently, if I don't want to call him a liar, so I'm going to come from the perspective that he believes that, at least from the scientific aspect, that he is landing on facts. And I literally could spend all day with quotes that would not line quite up with facts, but I picked three big ones, three that we kind of discussed a little bit. So I want to just go ahead and read these three quotes real quick and just show you that his scientific perspective is not factual at all. Right. It's highly opinionated and highly theoretical in something that, well, let me just read the quotes. So the first one we have, which in my book would have been found on page 75, it says, researchers are carefully considering the possibility that genetic mutation, size disparity, and behavior changes can result in breed isolation. We have the two words, considering and possibility. This is not scientific factual wording. This is, hey, it might, it could, or we can even, as many would say, I have hopes and dreams that this will work out.
Right.
Statement number two that he used, and this I believe was found on page number 84, it says, what is more logical, or what is the more logical inference, or the more reasonable extrapolation? Unlimited change from one kind to the other, or limited variations within the kind. The word more logical and the words more reasonable, those are not factual words. And these statements that I'm using were used in very key points of his, we'll say, scientific position. That he's, in fact, go ahead.
No, I was just not to interrupt you, but that particular statement, that in itself is another logical fallacy. It's how you can steer a conversation by only giving two opinions. What if there's a third, fourth, or fifth possibility?
And there's definitely a third one that could have been put
There's
into
a minimum. There's one other possibility
Yes.
in that statement that he simply ignores and pretends like it doesn't exist.
Yeah, in this very statement, what he's actually saying is the secular view of evolution more realistic, or my position of evolution more realistic? In reality, they're both evolution, and the wording that he uses is not scientific fact. It is, I hope and dream that you see where I'm coming from.
I wish it was this way.
I don't need to use the word what is more logical. I don't need to use what the word more reasonable if I'm operating off of facts. It's like, right here it is. Here's the facts. It is. And then the third one, it says, the majority of the world population is middle brown. What do you think Adam and Eve most likely would have been? Now, this whole book is pretty much built around that principle. And that's the scientific wording that we'll say the scientific facts that he's standing on, is what would be more likely. So, and I really could go on and on, but I kind of wanted just to reiterate that point where you're talking about the facts.
That particular third quote, what is more, that is the classic circular argument. You're assuming what you want and then building the argument from the conclusion, which is, I mean, that's what he's done there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's factual would not be, I just think it's an inaccurate and a misleading way of wording things, because when you start this chapter out, and this chapter that we're into now is, dare I say, and I know this may offend others, but this chapter we're walking into is either giving you a biblical road to walk without any worries, or he's leading you down a road that goes in complete violation of God's word. So this is a pretty important aspect. And for me, that's really my only agenda here. I'm not here to judge other people. I'm not here to tell other people what to do, how to live their lives. I promise you that when I see people that do things in their lives that I know that the Bible calls sin, I'm not going to, it doesn't cause me to get angry at them. If anything, it just causes me to grieve a little bit, because I see good people that are really wanting to know and understand God's will being led down a road that is going to really hurt that relationship between them and God.
Yes.
And so my only agenda here today is to help people avoid some of these traps that Satan is putting out there. And I think that this book could possibly be a tool in Satan's hands to lead people down a road that is not bringing them closer to God, but quite the opposite.
Amen. That's a wonderful point, and we're seeing that not just with this particular work. It just seems to be one of the more public examples of it, but in essentially all of the religious denominations now.
Well, it's because it's the world. If the world's pushed it, and then the religions, slowly but surely, they come in behind the world and say, okay, we're losing people in our congregations, and how am I going to, rather than stand solely with God, sola scriptura, and say I'll take who God sends me, we now have this mentality that I have to go and I got to pull the world into my church. The world doesn't want anything to do with my church, because even though we struggle with the idea of being separate, the world gets that concept really easy. They're like, I don't want anything to do with you guys. You guys have all these rules and regulations, and you got all these morals, and I don't want that. I want to just live my life how I think is good. And so the churches are forced to say, oh, well, how am I going to bring these people in that don't want anything to do with me? Oh, I know. I'll be a little bit more like them.
Exactly. That is definitely what we're seeing. And in not only in this particular area, but in a number of different areas.
Well, you brought up another point about Darwin. You know, they being the straw man, they camp out on him in a big way, and I saw that as well. And in fact, sometimes I kept asking myself, why does he keep calling it Darwin's evolution or Darwin's garden? he's a thing of the past. It is true that they have honored him as the father of evolution, but the evolution of today and Darwin's evolution are totally two different critters.
Right.
And one of the things that he brings out here is, if I'm going to read a quote here, it says, "Now, when most people think of race, they're thinking of lower races, higher races, black races, red races, etc. Even the best of us, at times, have struggled when we used that term." So again, you could read more in the paragraphs and you see that he's bringing this back to Darwin's fault, that when we look out into the world, that we see races as, we have the lower races and then we have the more evolved races. Okay? Now, it is true that Darwin, that is exactly what his book was promoting, that you have the lower races, and then we'll say I don't want to use the word lower. I don't even like that word.
Less developed.
Less evolved. Let's do it. Let's use their term. Okay, so we have the less evolved races, and you have the more evolved races. Obviously, that kind of thinking could stimulate the idea that, well, I'm better because I'm more evolved, and you're less because you're less evolved, if we looked at the world. Ken Ham is not that far off. Ken Ham believes the exact same thing, except the opposite. He doesn't use evolve. We use the word devolve, but that's what he's is kind of bringing out, is that you can't deny that there's differences in the people in the world. You just can't get around that. And if you do, you don't want to know the truth, and that's fine, and I respect that. But if you look at the people of the world, I'm not talking about a single neighborhood. I'm not talking about, a couple of families down the street. I'm talking about the world picture. You cannot deny that there are large pockets of people that are significantly different than other large pockets of people that look the same. That's just the way God made them. That doesn't mean they're better or worse. But here's how he is going to explain that. He explains it, in my opinion, through evolution, or he calls it devolve. He believes that some have devolved more than others. So we have this perfect creation, which he's claiming was through Adam and Eve, and then he says, out of that, we have some that didn't devolve very much, and then we have these people over here that devolved a bunch. Well, isn't that the exact same principle that he's attacking Darwin for, that there are people that are less and people that are more? It's just going the opposite direction.
Right.
So I personally think that his position on, it's evolution. His position on microevolution is as racist as you can get. If you want to compare, if you say Darwin is a racist perspective, then his perspective is sitting right there alongside of it. But here's what I'd like to show people, just so they understand. And I am in no way trying to defend evolution. But it's important that people understand that when you talk about evolution today, you're not going to get a good understanding of it from this book, because he's talking about baby evolution. He's talking about a guy who come up with an idea, had little understanding of the world, little understanding of science, and really lacked the technology and the ability to go from one place to another to really study this stuff outright.
Right.
So scientists have had to adjust their way of thinking, and it's come a long ways away from Darwin, because Darwin doesn't really match up to science at all.
I don't know where you're going with this argument, but I know not too terribly long ago, I've read a number of arguments from the secular scientific world where they, of course, just completely discount God's creation account. But yet they're trying in the best they can in this politically correct environment.
Yes.
To explain, well, how did we get here? Where are these different groups coming from?
That's exactly right.
Well, and many of these people have said, and they've been attacked for it. The classical, there was some hominid creature, the missing link, so to speak, that we evolved from. That's the argument. Well, a number of modern scientists have now had to theorize that there was more than one missing link.
There have, yes.
A lot of missing links, and that's the only way you can get from point A to point Z. And again, the assumption that they're underlying is that there's simply no way to start as you showed when we reviewed some of the genetics. No matter what your starting point is, there's no way to start with a single pair
and get
all of these different groups.
and
It doesn't
scientists.
work.
And see, you bring up such a good point that scientists get that.
If they're honest,
Ken
they
Ham's
get that.
not getting that, but scientists today are able to say they look at what Darwin said. Darwin's we'll just look at it at the basic perspective. When it started with Darwin, Darwin says, okay, so we have these group of people that appear to be, we'll say, lower evolved, and so from them they are a missing link.
Mm-hmm.
Then you come along and you have these other groups of people that seem like they're in between. They're another missing link. So what we're looking at is just different people have evolved further, but these are the missing links. Well, that didn't work. Obviously, that didn't work.
Right.
And so later it changed to where we actually evolved from different monkeys, you might say. You have one group of people evolved from the apes, one group of people evolved from the gorillas, one group of people evolved from the orangutan.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that still didn't work. That wasn't lining up. But then political correctness came along. And that hit the science world just as hard as it hit the church world. It hit them square in the face. And so here they are. They're looking out in the world and say, okay, we've got different people. We've got to figure out how to get that into evolution, but not be offensive. But we can't just say they're all identically the same, because that's scientifically inaccurate. We just can't, as much as we want to say this group of people and that group of people are identical genetically, we can't do it. So here's how they did it. Just so everyone understands where, we'll say, evolution stands today. And I'm going to have this chart put up. I know it's difficult. You can't hardly read anything on it, but you can see the picture that you get the principle here. And it starts with we'll say, the common ancestor. Whatever that guy's name is, I don't know. But we're going back millions of years. It does not say that from that common ancestor we get one race of people. And then later, another race of people comes out of that race of people. What it says is it's one of his great-great-great-grandchildren starts to look a little different, and he starts to go a different direction with his genetics. And then from that great-grandchild, that great-grandchild has another one, and they change a little bit and a little bit until it finally comes to what we would call a race today.
Mm-hmm.
But from that same common ancestor, he had a different great-great-great-grandchild that went in even a different direction, and then they continued to evolve and change and turn, and then that turned into another group of people. And it continued to do it. And the chart we have here shows 4 basic groups of people. So all these groups of people have a common ancestor, but none of them are in the same family line. They all have a separate family line, and as you can see in this chart, we have the one here that goes off here to my right that ultimately ends up as what we'd call the African people today. And then you have the other, the one next to it that goes up to what we call the Caucasian people. And then we have the Oriental people. And this one over here to my far left appears to be, I think, the Aborigine people. Now, here's what they've done that helps this case work. And Ken Ham, and I think we showed in our last genetics class that we did the last week, we showed that from one race, you can't get more.
Right.
Then we went so far to say, okay, well, let's just assume that Adam and Eve were made up of 2 people, which is, I think, is so ludicrous, it even hurts for me to say it. But we went ahead and walked down that road. So those of you that didn't watch that, make sure that you catch that. But we went ahead and took a genetic journey, a real quick one, assuming that Adam and Eve were actually 2 different races. And what we found is that out of that, there could only come a 3rd race. So out of Adam and Eve and their offspring, you would only get one other race, and that's as far as you could go. So in the world, if Adam and Eve were 2 different races, there would only be 3 races in the world today. Well, guess what? Scientists are looking in the world and going, okay, there's way more than that. So we can't use Ken Ham's position, so we have to come up to where each individual race has its own separation. It has its own family tree. And so that's what they've done. And so here they've given us at least 4, we'll say, foundational races. Now, if we take this guy here, and he marries into this race over here, they will get an offspring that is, we'll say, a new race, a new genetic package. And then this one over here marries that one, and then they have a new genetic package. Then those genetic packages marrying each other, then they're going to get another one.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have maybe 3 or more races, then we can start to see the variety that we see in the world. But we can't get the variety we see in the world from Adam and Eve if they were just one race. And we can't get the variety in the world from Adam and Eve, even if Adam and Eve were 2 races. And scientists know that. Ken Ham's the one that's struggling to catch up. So as inaccurate as this idea that we all come from some common ape back in the day, at least the scientists understand that we have to get these guys genetically separate in order to begin to explain what we see in the world. And Ken Ham is doing the opposite. He's trying to get everyone genetically the same, and it's scientifically impossible. I think the scientists, the world would love to be able to say, oh yeah, we're all out of the same family tree. We're all out of the same line. But we can't do that because it won't work. And they at least have to make it look like it works.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they have the advantage that the atheistic or agnostic scientist has the advantage of being able to appeal to more or less any span of time he wants.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this happened over 500,000 years. This happened over 3 million years. However long he wants to do it. Ken Ham has locked himself into in fact, he's probably best known for his work about the young Earth creationism. He's got to try to make this work in 6,000 years, give or take.
Yeah, a really short period of time.
And it's just, it makes it even more absurd and less plausible.
And when you got the flood in there, that cuts off 1,000 or so years, and then you start to intercede history to where we begin to see some of the genetic claims that he has.
Mm-hmm.
I think we even used the example of a cat that you can find. You can go back pretty far in history and see that the house cat existed just a few thousand years ago. How do you explain that we haven't seen a house cat turn into a lion, or did the lion turn the house cat? We haven't seen that happen here recently.
No.
So what was going on back then that's not going on now, and whatever was going on back then should be seen now because it was only a short time ago.
It should still be going on. It should be an ongoing process.
Well, what do you think about this right here? Where, because I'm still on the same page, where you just drop down the next paragraph, he goes into the idea that, well, we're basically just, less than 0.5% difference. In fact, let me go ahead and read it. Every human being in the world is classified as Homo sapien. Scientists today agree that there is really only one biological race of humans. Now, I just showed you what scientists today believe with that chart. So I don't want to put words in the scientist's mouth. They do believe that we all come from a common ancestor, but they obviously don't believe that we're so identical that we could come from each other.
Well, Nate, I'd just like to say again, in that sentence, there it is again, that's that populist fallacy and the appeal to authority. That the fact that if every scientist of every discipline walking on Earth today believed a certain thing, that by itself would not make the thing true.
No, that's true.
That's just simply not an argument for truth or falsehood.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's the classic fallacy of the appeal to an authority and the appeal to whether or not the argument is popular.
Mm-hmm.
That's all he's proving by that.
Yes, and I'm not even sure that what he's saying is even true of these men. If I take what I've heard him say in the book so many times, he just kind of makes things up as he goes. It seems that way. It's hard for. I mean, I'm not saying one way or another, and it doesn't really change anything. But when we read on, we finally get to the what says genetics have found that if we were to take any two people from anywhere in the world, the basic genetic differences between the two people would typically be around 0.2%. Well, I have to point out the word would typically. I'm curious. Are we just 0.2% difference, or is there a variation? Now, my book has a little footnote down at the bottom about that statement. I don't know if yours does or not, but if I jump down to the bottom for that little footnote, It says the numbers, I'm talking about the 0.2% difference between the people. It says the numbers is now being suggested to be between 0.5 and 0.9, almost 1% difference. So he's building a case. He says right here that we're really only 0.2% difference. Any group of people in the world. Now, this is what I want to, hopefully I can bring out. One, he uses the word typically. Well, if that means that if I go to North Africa and then I go to Central Africa and I take those two people that are basically from two different parts of the world and bring them together, I might get a typical 0.2%. Well, let's expand that out a little bit. What if I go to Sydney, Australia and grab someone, and I go up to Montreal, Canada, and I grab someone, and I bring those guys together and do their DNA, and I say, well, they're typically 0.2%. Yeah. So my question is this typical 0.2%, where does he get, what people are we comparing? I'm not really sure what his study is, but if we're getting people from different parts of the world that are basically the same genetic people, or really, 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 really close, yeah, that's possible. But what about this 1%? Went down here in the little footnote there. Now, does your book have this?
I believe it does. I've got it. I actually laid my book down here if I can reach it. And I believe it does have that.
Well, I'm curious if it does, because here's why. My book's a really old book. So I can see that he puts in here, 0.2%. And then he says, later after he wrote the book, he says, you know what? We've come up with some different numbers, is what it says. And it says, now the numbers are being suggested at 0.5 to 0.9. He says, okay, well, I'm not going to reprint my book. I'm just going to go ahead and put a footnote in there and be done with it. So did yours have the same footnote?
Well, he says, I don't know if yours contains this second sentence. This is due to the sequencing of the genome of two specific individuals, meaning that genetic variation accountable to race. And the word race is in the scary quotes. Like,
yeah, always got the quotations.
Accountable to race could be as high as 0.054%, which is still a very insignificant percentage.
All right.
This one contains that sentence.
Here's my point. Why doesn't he go ahead and take the information that he has down below and go ahead and put it in the top? Or does yours not have yours incorporated into the sentence?
Oh, it's not. It's in a footnote.
It's in a footnote.
Yes.
Why is it in a footnote? Most people don't read the footnote. This is my opinion. Now, that's my opinion. I agree. But I say most people read that, they see the footnote, and they move on. They don't take the time to read the footnote, that what he's actually saying is, it's not really accurate information I'm giving you. There's other information out there that contradicts it, but even if it does, it's still getting my point across. It's insignificant.
Well, Nathan, let me take it a step further. I don't know if you've considered this or not. He uses these numbers, he starts with the number 0.012, and then goes, the number is suggested to 0.5, 0.9, and uses the number 0.05. A person ought to stop, 0.05% of what? There's a great difference in 0.05% of 100, 0.05% of 1 million, and 0.05% of 100 million. How many genes are we talking about?
Oh, of course we know this.
In the genome.
Yeah.
So you can use these, so that's a tiny percentage. But again, the volume of, would you rather have 0.05% of $100 or 0.05% of $100 million? Same principle.
Yeah. Well, on that, here's what gets me. He said, well, it's basically, it's a really, really small number. Well, when it comes to genetics, there really isn't such a thing as a small number. But here's what I like people to see, is that the same people that he's getting his genetic information from, I assure you Ken Ham does not have a genetics lab. He is just simply taking what the secular scientists are putting out there, and then he's applying it to his own, and that's fine. That's fine. I know that the secular scientists have their agenda, they have their own religion, but at the same time, there is stuff that they put out there that is factual. It's real science. It's when they start saying, we're taking the facts that we have and telling you how they apply to the origin of life. Then we get into theories,
that's when we
start getting messed up. But the same scientists that say that we are somewhere between 0.5 and 0.9% the same also say that there is a group of individuals out there that are just 1% different than us. And those guys are called chimpanzees. This guy here is basically, genetically speaking, if I'm going to use Ken Ham's terms, the same as you and me. This guy does not look anything like us. And there's a lot about him. There's got some similarities now. And now they've come to know that there's another guy out there that we were equally related to, and that is the bonobo. Well, here's what's interesting is, and I think this is where we really need to start thinking about stuff, is that our 1% difference with the bonobo is not the same 1% difference from the chimpanzee, which it's very complicated for me to articulate this. But what's missing from the chimpanzee, or we'll say what's different between me and the chimpanzee, will not be the exact same differences as what makes me different from the bonobo.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the bonobo and the chimpanzee carry about the same similarities as Ken Ham is claiming that all the races of the world have. And then we can go a step further. I believe, if I have my numbers right, that we're 30% the same as like a banana, genetically. Now, I agree 30% and 99.9% is a big jump. But we have one creator, and the idea that there's going to be some genetic similarities amongst all creatures. Now, evolutionists take these genetic similarities to say, okay, well, the banana and the human, obviously, billions of years ago, had a common ancestor.
The same slime pit.
Yeah, we're all coming from the same place. A Christian, hopefully, is able to see that we have a single creator. And if I build a house, if let's say I build houses for a living, each house that I built maybe look a little different. But I'm going to have a lot of similarities inside. I'm going to use the same designs for the stud walls. I'm going to use the same design for the foundation, the same kind of concrete, the same nails. But I may build a ranch-style house, or I may build a Victorian-style house. Nothing about them is identical at all. You look at them and you clearly see this is a different house, have different functions, are going to function in different weather, whatever it might be. But if I go and start breaking that house down into little bitty parts, and I go, oh, well, he used a 2x4 in this Victorian house, and he used a 2x4 in that ranch house, they must be the same. And that's really...
That is an absurdity.
It is an absurdity, and that's the genetic, we'll say, the background. Now, that's that he's coming from, is that if I can just find something close, that automatically means we're the same. Close is not the same. And I'm going to bring up a quote that he had about a cake. Jesus.